say I'm glad we're all here, and especially because some of you did say you're new to the community. Maybe you can connect and we'll wander around even if we get locked in at 8 o'clock. I'll try to be succinct, although that's hard. Come on, I'm a lawyer. I get paid by the word. All right, well, I want to give you a little overview of where we've come in this country in terms of women's equality. And along the way to maybe point out some of the things that we can learn from what has gone before. The first ever women's rights conference, not just in the United States, but in the world as far as is recorded, took place in Seneca Falls in 1848. And it was called before the internet, before text, before tweeting. On very short notice, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and a group of folks called for a women's rights convention. It started, as so often the women's movement has come out of, the progressive movement of the day, the liberal movement of the day. So they had been involved in ending slavery. They went to anti-slavery meetings and found that they were expected to listen and not speak, to be seen and not heard. And they decided that, of course, they needed a women's movement to advance their own equality. Just like the feminist movement that came around in the 60s came around because the civil rights and anti-war and free speech movement had so often relegated women to making coffee, not policy. Another t-shirt that I think I have, or maybe it was a bumper sticker. But it is often the case that's how women's activism has grown because of finding themselves excluded, at least excluded from leadership in places where they expected to be welcomed and their talents put to use. So 1848, they're in Seneca Falls, about 300 women showed up and men, and what they discovered as they were getting ready to go into the church where they were meeting was that none of the women had any idea how to chair a meeting because they had never done such a thing. So the first day of the conference, a man chaired the meeting. And then they kind of got the hang of it and the women took over. One of the things that happened, as you probably have heard, many of you, is that they came up with what was called the Declaration of Sentiments. And it called for all of the types of equality and fairness that they were seeking. And they covered every possible institution you can imagine. They were calling for equality in education, in religion, in the family. I would have thought that would have been controversial. In every aspect, their economic well-being. And the only one that was controversial was when they called for the right to vote for women. Now, to me, calling for equality in religion, for instance, in religious institutions, should have set the earth shaking, but it was the right to vote that got everybody all excited. In fact, the plank of the Declaration of Sentiments on women's right to vote probably wouldn't have passed, except that Stephen Douglas was there. He's another one of my favorite characters in history, and Stephen Douglas argued adamantly that women needed to have the right to vote if they were going to achieve these other aspects of life that they wanted. So that plank passed. It was the only plank that was not passed unanimously. After that, well, let me just give you a notion of how controversial it was. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married to Henry Stanton. Good liberal that he was, he left town rather than be there when his wife was arguing in favor of this radical notion of women's right to vote. He went back to Boston. He was out of there. The local newspapers of the day had a field day reporting on this conference, and they called the women, they said that women were calling for the right to vote that was unnatural, that they were unmarried spinsters, which was as close as they could get in that day to lesbian baiting. Which is designed, of course, to make us all step back. Oh no, I really don't want the right to vote, and I'm really not gay. Let me just go back to the kitchen here. It'll be fine. It was so harsh in the criticism from the media and from their friends and family that a number of women took their name off of the Declaration of Sentiments. To me, that has resonance today, because so often what is a radical notion today is going to become tomorrow's of course. Once we got the right to vote, I have debated and I've been on Bill O'Reilly's show, I've been to all kinds of places. I have never found anyone, no matter how conservative, who said women shouldn't have the right to vote. Yet that was an outrageous demand in 1848. So I think there's some things to learn there. More than 70 years it took us to win the right to vote for women. 1920 was a momentous year. It was the year my mother was born, and I'm very glad for that part. And it's also the year that women finally got the right to vote. And I've never said that women were given the right to vote, because they earned it fair and square. They fought for it, they died for it, they went to jail for it, they were abused. It was a tough fight. I want to flash forward now to 1972 to 82. During that 10-year period, the Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution was out to the states for ratification. The minute they got the right to vote passed, the same women put forward the Equal Rights Amendment, and it's patterned on the 19th Amendment right to vote, the right of women and to legal equality under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. In any case, it was introduced in 1922, I think, and it took all the way to 1972 to get Congress to even send it out to the states to be ratified. So for 10 years, we had a campaign that resulted at the end in particular with every organizational group of women, in particular AAUW and NOW and League of Women Voters and Women's Political Caucus and the YWCA and the National Council of Jewish Women. Everybody was supporting it. All across the population, the public opinion was in favor of equality, and it was across racial and ethnic lines, across ages, across religions, and yet we could not get it ratified. There's a reason for that, and I'll tell you my own state of Florida, which is now my state, Indiana. I still, got a good place in my heart, but I'm now a Floridian. Our state was one of the unratified states. If you looked at a map of the United States, the unratified states that did not want a guarantee of equality for women under the law were the old Confederacy. The states that tried to rescind their ratification, they voted yes and then they tried to change their mind, were the border states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then the states out west around Utah, which were heavily Mormon. So we mounted a major campaign in the last year and a half or 2 years of the time for ratification. The time for ratification had been extended slightly, but it was only until June 1982. There was a method to that madness, because as you know, every 10 years there's a census, and based on the census, the district lines for Congress and for the states are redrawn to try to get more equal representation. Well, in Florida, in that 10 years since reapportionment redistricting, the population was severely disproportionately represented. South Florida and the slight west coast of Florida were way underrepresented. And the northern Florida, which is really Alabama and Georgia extended south, were overrepresented. The year after we lost that campaign, and I'm sure some of you remember well, we had women and men who, many of us had been active for the first time politically. Mm-hmm. We had voted incumbents out of office who didn't agree with us. We had gotten better people in office, and we had learned to do public speaking. We had learned to do fundraising. We had learned how to do community organizing, to reach out to other parts of the community. We had religious outreach. We even had We had one senator in South Florida whose name is Dick Anderson. He was a former Miami Dolphin and very popular. And we actually found out where he shopped. And we got people where he shopped, cashiers, to speak to him about the Equal Rights Amendment. We lobbied his wife and his girlfriend. We knew no shame. And so when the Florida legislature and the North Carolina legislature and the other legislatures did not vote for the Equal Rights Amendment, we were well organized, well trained, and pissed off. And so the chant that last day of the vote in Florida and everywhere else that it went down was vote them out and we'll remember in November. And we did. When Ellie Smeal, who was then the president of the National Organization for Women, and really brilliant, a strange and wonderful woman, but really quite brilliant in political analysis, did the analysis, what we saw was in the state legislatures, every African American had voted for the Equal Rights Amendment. There were few enough Hispanics that they really couldn't get good data. Almost all the women had voted for the Equal Rights Amendment. There just weren't enough of us there. But we were going to stop begging for our rights from men in power and become the people in power. We started recruiting people to run for office at the local level, to get them in the pipeline, to move them up from city council and state legislatures into congressional seats and mayoral and governor's mansions. We really filled up that pipeline. After the 1982 election, in November 1982, we had changed enough votes in Florida, which is the one I know best, that we could have passed the Equal Rights Amendment because it was reapportioned and redistricted so that it was more representative of the population. Now I tell you that because gerrymandering is still alive and well. And so the next time that's going to come around again, I want you to learn where that decision is made. In Florida, the state legislature draws the lines, and it's an incumbent protection system. Across party lines, they protect themselves. But for instance, in Florida, it's this is a nonpartisan group, and this is not a partisan comment, because the Democrats are not any better than the Republicans in terms of gerrymandering. Everybody wants to protect their incumbents. But the Republicans in Florida took districts and drew lines that put as many African Americans in the same district so that there would be whiter districts around them that they thought they could win. And sure enough, it worked. We have passed a state constitutional amendment requiring that there be certain criteria that disallow partisan considerations. And it's been to the Florida Supreme Court several times, and it was upheld. And the League of Women Voters was the lead plaintiff in that lawsuit. So you come with a proud tradition of working against gerrymandering. So figure out where in your state it is, some of them it's the governors who take the lead. And keep an eye on that so that the next time we have that situation, you can help. Part of what I want to do tonight is to remind us the incredible progress we've made. After 1982, when we changed the strategy to get more women to run, to get more women elected, we started filling the pipeline, and that led to 1992, which was the so-called Year of the Woman. Like we would be happy with 1 year and one woman, right? The Year of the Woman, 1992. And we have kept that movement going, but we've really stalled in many ways. So I want to encourage all of you to run for office. So let me just start there. And I know as I say that, some of you are sitting there thinking, oh, but you have to be qualified. Look at the current incumbents. I hereby pronounce all of you qualified, okay? I want more of your experience brought to the table. I mean, you have lived lives, many of you long years, and have experience that's valuable and that may not be represented in your state legislature, on your city council, in your congressional delegation. So that's one of the things you can do. But I want to emphasize the incredible progress we have made. When I got married the first time, it lasted a year. Come on, he was the most handsome man I'd ever seen. He had a car and he could dance. Do you need anything else for a long-lasting marriage? And just so you know, I got married again in 1968 and we're still together, all right? So, however, when I first got married, birth control was illegal, even for married couples in some states in this country. And while it was not illegal in Indiana, it certainly was not encouraged. Abortion was the leading cause of maternal death, and illegal abortion was the leading cause of maternal death. My mother had a miscarriage and went to the Porter County Hospital and almost died of infection because the tests kept showing she was pregnant even after the miscarriage. And they were so afraid of the anti-abortion laws that they would not do a D&C on her. And she got terribly sick and infected before her body decided to show them that she was not pregnant and they could do the D&C. So it has repercussions all along the way. When I first entered the workforce, people still argued that women did not need or deserve equal pay for equal work, and no law required it. The arguments were that women worked for pin money. Those were the little extras near and dear to our hearts, but had nothing to do with the support of our families. And now again, most people would not argue that we don't need equal pay for equal work. That's kind of a given, like the right to vote has become kind of a given. When I started law school, 1972, Richard Nixon vetoed a national child care bill, and in a veto message written by Pat Buchanan, he called it the Sovietization of American children. Child care as a commie plot. Now we have an overwhelming majority in the population who believe that there should be sufficient child care for the children that we are having and raising. Well into my legal career, head and master laws were still in some states. I think in Louisiana in particular. Head and master laws were the embodiment of that old common law principle, husband and wife are one, and that one is the husband. So if you were married, your husband could sell or mortgage the property that you owned without your knowledge or even over your objection. And it took us years, and it was part of the guilt legislation during the Equal Rights Amendment campaign. They would say, oh, we don't need the federal government telling us how to take care of our women. And so we would point out the head and master law, and they would finally repeal it. And so all of that progress has been so important. We won equal employment laws, we won equal education laws, we won equal credit laws. We got from the Supreme Court Roe v. Wade, building on prior decisions that said birth control was a protected right, a fundamental right, and moving to abortion with Roe v. Wade. We changed public opinion, and then we wrapped public policy around it. Let me give you two examples of how that works, because what I'm getting ready to get into is that we have the majority of public opinion on a lot of the things that we care about, and we can't get the legislatures to act. And there's a reason for that. Part of it is that I'm sorry, Indiana, but you're 51st out of 50 states in terms of the percentage of people who are voting. That's a little sad. But look, you've got nowhere to go but up. I mean, you want to be inspired? You've got nowhere to go but up. It can only get better, I hope. On television now, HBO has a movie called Confirmation, and it's about the Anita Hill testimony against Clarence Thomas. If you can think back, those of you who remember Thurgood Marshall, and when the nomination of Clarence Thomas to replace Thurgood Marshall came through, many of us were disquieted, to say the least. And then Anita Hill's testimony came. And then when she was first brought forward, and she didn't come forward willingly, her story was presented to the committee. They'd already finished the hearings. They said they were not going to start them up again, that they didn't need to hear from her. Well, the first task was to get them to listen to her. But once she started talking, it broke open something incredible in this country. Started talking about sexual harassment on the job and what it had meant and what it had done to her. And women started telling their stories all over the country. And they were telling their stories sometimes that the men they loved and loved them had never heard before, because they had all decided it was something they had. What did I do that made him think I wanted to have sex with him? And so Anita Hill, by her testimony, broke that story open, and people all over the country were focused on it. And as a result, we were able to amend the equal employment laws to get a right to trial by jury, which we didn't have, and a right to damages, which we didn't have. The classic story was a boss chasing his secretary around the desk, and she went out into the hall to get away from him. She opened an exit door and fell down the stairs and severely injured herself. Under the old law, she could not have gotten damages for those injuries, but only back pay and front pay for the employment discrimination. So we gained something by that. Another horrible situation when Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were murdered. And the stories started coming out that O.J. Simpson had had domestic violence calls before and had been given a laughingly small fine for a man in his position at that point in his life, and had been able to do counseling by telephone on anger management and not being a batterer. And so then, by those stories coming out, although again he was not convicted, it enabled us to leverage the Violence Against Women Act out of Congress, and to get training for judges, for police officers, to get funding for battered women's shelters, all kinds of incredible change to the Violence Against Women Act. So once we get focus of the country on a key issue and people realize what's going on, we can often step forward. The other piece of that, though, is that although we've made incredible progress, there's three things about progress. Progress is not inevitable, it's not equality, and it's not irreversible. I'll give you an example of in the area of birth control and abortion. Post Roe versus Wade, there was a big backlash. And in 1976, Congress passed the Hyde Amendment to the budget, which said no federal funding could go toward abortion. That's been passed on each budget since then. But after that, things really settled down. And the truth of the matter is that access to abortion was better in the late 70s and early 80s than it is today. And once again, Indiana's right in the lead. Governor Pence just signed, after your state legislature passed, the most restrictive anti-abortion law in this country. And it does incredible things. For one thing, it identifies certain reasons. You can't have abortion if you're for certain reasons, which means that communication between a woman and her doctor is going to be chilled. Are you going to be open and honest in talking with your doctor about your medical needs if you know that if you say certain things, even if they're true, your doctor's going to have to refuse any assistance to you? RU486, which is the medical abortion, which has become very popular in recent years, and there are now states that were requiring that doctors prescribe mifepristone, RU46, based on the FDA's recommendation. Well, the FDA's recommendation came out years earlier and was much higher a dose than you actually needed. And rather than flood women with these hormones, doctors started dropping the amount that they were prescribing. So the state legislatures come along and they know that doctors in good faith aren't going to want to use the higher dosage, and they say, but you have to follow the FDA's recommendation. So now we have to go to the FDA and get them to change it, to what is now the current medical practice. But these kinds of things are building. In Indiana, as of July 1st, it goes into effect. If you have a miscarriage, you have to have an interment or a cremation. You have to bury the remains. It's an incredible state law. Thank you very much. And last year, of course, your legislature passed and the governor signed the so-called Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This was the part of the topic of my discussion with the Unitarians yesterday morning. I can't figure out whose religion, but it is not a majority-supported position. Even in Indiana, it's not a majority-supported position that lesbians and gays, LGBT communities should not have equal rights in the workplace, for instance. It's not. So here we are looking at that sort of thing. And I would also raise to your attention what I consider some of the great unfinished business of the women's movement. And that is, yes, we want the right to decide when and whether to have children, but we also need to have the means to raise and educate our children. Healthy children who are physically, emotionally, spiritually healthy and who are well educated. And so I know there's been a lot of discussion here in Indiana about testing standards. And again, the majority of opinion is against what the government is doing these days on the school boards and the like. So the majority of eligible voters do support parental leave, paid parental leave. The majority of voters have great concerns about testing. Another area is in the wage gap. In the 1980s, we closed the wage gap by 10 points. In 1990s, it closed by another 4 points. And then in the first decade of the 21st century, we have had a decade of stagnation. It has virtually not moved. It's moved maybe a penny in the last 16 years. So the majority of voters want to adopt measures that would help promote equality of pay because the majority of families depend on the income of a woman, either as part of a couple who are both in the waged workforce, and often the kids are trying to get jobs as well, or because they're the sole support of their children. So all of these issues, we want to make our voices heard. And the way we make our voices heard is with our votes. Now, I hear people complaining about politicians pandering. I want more pandering. I want them to respond to what we want, what the majority of us want. And to do that, we need more people voting. So congratulations to this league chapter who registered, what, about 100 students?
Yeah,
how much?
112.
112 high school students were registered to vote. That's a great thing. And you can register, and also it just happens that younger people are more in favor of the issues I care about, so great. And I want to urge all of you to help with that. There's so many things you can do. You can register people to vote. And right now that it's too late to register people to vote for the primary, but you got the general coming up in November. You can, I know, register yourselves if you're not registered. And when the time comes to vote, both for the primary and the general, you can take 10. Take 10 people with you to vote. It's easy. You talk to your friends, because that's the other thing I'm going to urge you to do, and that is to speak up. Speak up at your workplace, speak up at your place of worship, speak up in your family. Talk about these issues. Be willing to just make yourself a little uncomfortable by speaking up. I remember very well, there is, well, Michael Bolton is one, but there was a football player as well. And both of them told me essentially the same story. Michael Bolton's mother is part of Planned Parenthood, so he's got a good stand on that. But this football player who had been in the locker rooms, and he was an NFL guy, and of course, I don't know enough about basketball. I'm from Indiana. I could tell you about basketball, football. Anyway, he said in the locker room, they would say the most offensive things about women. And he finally got up the nerve to say, you know, I really find that offensive. My mother's a woman, my sister's a woman. Don't talk like that around me. He said afterward, man after man, player after player came up and said to him on the QT, I'm so glad you said that, I feel the same way. But they wouldn't speak up. And I think sometimes it just takes one person to break it open, to start saying something, and then you find out who are the others. Okay, those are the people you take to the polls. Make sure they're registered and get them with you, you know. So speaking up and speaking out is very important. Registering voters, taking people with you to the polls, and then after you get people elected, visit them, call them, support them, remind them. And look at the media. You don't have to be a big media star. Call in radio talk shows, write a letter to the editor, draft an opinion piece if you're a writer. And in doing so, you help change public opinion. Join organizations. Join the League of Women Voters. Is everybody here a member? How many of you are members of the League? Okay, so there's audiences here. You could join the League of Women Voters, and it would be a good thing because this is a newly revitalized chapter, and they're doing great work. They've had candidate forums that were very well attended and were actually done right, where the candidates had to come and speak. Imagine that. And so, you know, join the National Organization for Women. We have a great organization nationally. There's not a chapter locally because Valerie started the League. All right, it's good. But I want you to be a part of making change and to remember that what feels like a very small step, albeit sometimes a scary step, it all adds up. If you all are doing that, and people in my town of Homestead, Florida, south of Miami, are doing that, and people in New England and in Nebraska are all doing that, it adds up. And you start getting a momentum going that can become a real serious change. I don't know about you, I wouldn't want people to think of me the way I was in 1962, the last time I lived here year-round. And I want to see the same kind of progress that we had from 1962 to 2016 in the next 30 or 40 years. I'm eating right, keeping fit, look both ways when I cross the streets, because I want to see where this is going. And I'm counting on you to make sure it's going in the right direction. You have an important role to play. Maybe you're shy, okay, then you write things. Maybe you like to speak, so, you know, the National Council of Jewish Women trained me to speak. They had speakers training during the Equal Rights Amendment campaign. There are so many ways that you can get to be able to do some sort of work that will make a difference. And I'm really counting on you, and I really thank you for everything you've done up to this point and everything you're going to do in the future. Thank you very much.